King supposed to give, um, which is just really cool, I think. Um, hang on, where's the YouTube thing? There's always like a little,
Yeah,
okay,
it's there.
yes, yes, thank you. I just want to hit that button so then I can, supposed to give. All right, listen to myself talk and then hate myself forever. Okay, all right. Sorry, I'm giving you guys a meta show here, and it's literally called meta. What? Okay. Are we live?
Yep.
All right, great. So for everybody joining us tonight, welcome. Although I'm sure whoever's watching this is watching it way after the fact, because I haven't seen many likes or views. Maybe there's some. But anyway, we're going to be talking about the idea tonight, and rather than just starting off the discussion as if we read it, we're actually going to read some lines from it because you know it's just fun. Yes. So, Kyle, read 1631.
Thank you, Alex. The idea is the adequate notion, that which is objectively true or true as such. When anything, whatever possesses truth, is possessed it through its idea, or something possesses truth only insofar as it is idea. The expression idea has often been employed in philosophy as an ordinary life or notion. Indeed, even for a mere ordinary conception. I have no idea yet of this lawsuit, building, neighborhood, means nothing more than the ordinary conception. Kant has reclaimed the expression idea for the notion of reason. Now, according to Kant, the notion of reason is supposed to be the notion of the unconditioned, but a notion transcendent in regard to phenomena. That is, no empirical use can be made of such notion that is adequate to it. The notions of reason are to serve for the comprehension of perceptions, the notions of the understanding for understanding them. But in fact, if the latter really are notions, then they are notions. They enable one to comprehend and understanding of perceptions by means of notions of the understanding will be a comprehension of them.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kyle. Yes, so you can see here that Hegel is starting to do several things all in one paragraph. He's talking about the difference between the idea in this chapter and the idea as it's normally thought of, common sense, just everyday practical usage. But he's also talking about Kant and how Kant has, while he's reclaimed the expression for reason, it's, well, we can't really make any use of it. We can't know anything with it. It's just sort of there. Uh, and that's very weird. I haven't read Kant yet, but I'm sure if I read some of him, it would become clear. Um, I keep coming across the fact that if you really want to dig into why Hegel approaches Kant from this perspective, you have to read the critique of practical reason, as opposed to just the critique of pure reason, to get the full flavor of what reason actually practically can touch, according to Kant. Okay, I'm going to read 1632. But if understanding is only a determining of perceptions by such categories, as for example, whole and parts, force, cause, and the like, it signifies only a determining by reflection. And similarly, by understanding can be meant only the specific representation of a completely determined sensuous content. Thus, when someone having been directed that at the end of the wood he must turn left, replies, I understand. Understanding means nothing more than the grasping of something in pictorial thought and in memory. Notions of reason, too, is a somewhat clumsy expression, for the notion is something altogether rational, and insofar as reason is distinguished from understanding in the notion as such, it is the totality of the notion and of objectivity. In this sense, the idea is the rational. It is the unconditioned because only that has conditions which essentially relates itself to an objectivity, but an objectivity that it has not itself determined, but which still confronts it in the form of indifference and externality, just as the external end still had conditions. Okay, so Jim, Kyle, what is he saying here exactly?
This is the extremes.
So if you're going off perceptions
Yeah.
and you're trying to build universals from perceptions, really you're stuck at the level of reflection. You're reflecting on it and it makes an impression and it's a pretty shallow impression. I'm getting the sense from it. So you know, can be meant only the specific representation of a determined sensuous content. So you have a picture in your mind of whatever it is that you're trying to talk about, right? And by understanding, when someone talks to you, you think of what the wood would look like, what the left-hand turn would look like, what it would look like once you make that left-hand turn. But it doesn't go very much further than that in a practical sense, which there's nothing wrong with, right? It gets you from A to B, right? And it gets you oriented, right? There's nothing wrong with it. Um, uh,
I think Plato had a similar idea as well. That's why, I mean, in the case of Plato, that's why he posited the existence of the forms. So basically, you would rise above the sensuous level,
yeah,
and so he would say like geometry was, I think, was one of his primary examples of how you go beyond the sensuous. You go to the strictly rational.
yeah,
So like in geometry, people might draw pictures but when you do a proof, you're not really reliant on the pictures. You're reasoning from axioms and to theorems. And once you have theorems, you can go on reason to other new theorems.
well, I got it. Right. Yeah. No, no, exactly. I know what you mean, Jim. Let's read on because usually he clarifies a lot of what he hasn't yet in the previous paragraph. Uh, Jim, do you feel comfortable reading 1633?
Right.
Do you want me
Reserving,
to? Yeah.
yeah, reserving then the expression idea for the objective or real notion and distinguishing it from the notion itself and still more from mere pictorial thought, we must also reject even more vigorously that estimate of the idea according to which it is not anything actual and true. Thoughts are said only to be only ideas. If thoughts are merely subjective and contingent, they certainly have no further value, but in this respect, they are not inferior to temporal and contingent actualities, which likewise have no further value than that of contingencies and phenomena. On the other hand, if conversely, the idea is not to have the value of truth because in regard to phenomena, it is transcendent and no congruent object can be assigned to it, in the world of sense. This is an odd misunderstanding that would deny objective validity to the idea because it lacks that which constitutes appearance, namely the untrue being of the objective world. In regard to practical ideas, Kant recognizes that nothing can be more harmful and unworthy of a philosopher than the vulgar appeal to an experience that allegedly conflicts with the idea. This very experience do not even exist. For example, political institutions have been established at the proper time in conformity with ideas, and if crude conceptions, crude just because they have been drawn from experience, have not taken the place of ideas, and so nullified every good intention. Kant regards the idea as a necessity and as the goal, which as the archetype, it must be our endeavor to set up for a maximum and to which we must strive to bring the condition of the actual world even nearer.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. So here, let's see, what are some of the ideas that he said here? We must also reject even more vigorously the estimate of the idea, according to which it is not anything actual, but true thoughts are said to be only ideas. So the mere idea as sort of this untrue object.
Kind of an over abstraction away, but giving that reality is more true than the concept. Yeah.
Yeah.
Empiricism. Yeah.
Yeah. See, and that's like he has a way of taking complicated ideas in this paragraph, like the idea that the idea is not to have the value of truth, and so being transcendent, you can't actually assign it to any.
I get the fixings off you.
The idea that you couldn't assign it to any particular object. In the sensual world, that's very odd, you know. Like, I mean, even universals that you can't smell, see, or touch. We often, like when we think of freedom, we associate them in our minds to sensual objects. You know, whether or not they're actually really congruent, we still do it, right? But to say that freedom couldn't be actually assigned to an object like the flag is very odd. And Hegel, I think, here is like that's not even a thing that happens, right? It happens every day. It's like the swastika. We talk about the swastika, bam. We have a whole range of sensual experiences, even ones that we've never actually experienced in our lives. We can associate it with the gas chambers, pistols shooting people, stuff like that. So that stuff happens every day, and it's quite it's quite common. Not even common. It's ubiquitous in our world that we would reverse the process and take universals that we've created through sensuous experience and turn them back onto sense experience. Let's see here. The Kant part is a little more difficult. In regard to practical ideas,
Daddy,
Hmm.
brush your teeth.
Mhm.
Brush your teeth.
All right, I'll be right back. Just a second.
Well, I do find it funny. I'm trying to go in having read Hegel at this depth of level. I feel like I'm getting already a lot more out of Kuhn's book than I would have expected. But I guess because he's arguing from are using philosophical terms that didn't make sense, that I didn't have a real grasp of in that way 20 years ago. Oh, let me see.
Kuhn, as I recall, was not very good about attribution of the ideas he discussed. A lot of them were, I mean, there were several contemporary writers of the time who had similar ideas. Some of them at Harvard at the same time he was there, and he does not say, "Oh, I got from this guy or this professor." He just discusses the ideas, and it doesn't say where he got the ideas from. So you could read Kuhn and think it's all everything was his ideas, and people actually complained about it at the time too.
Yeah, because all the references I see are to the actualities of of his conceptions of science than to the actual, theories itself, like where those came from, right?
Like, for example, some of his ideas were basically derived, I think, from Philip Frank, who was actually teaching at Harvard about the same time, but he never mentions him by name.
It reminds me of Ingalls talking about um, Düring, and how when you take a look at Düring's philosophy, he says, if this sounds familiar, it is. It's just Hegel with a lot of the labels changed.
Yeah.
And the problem with doing that is it's a vulgarization of Hegel. If you take the basic logical categories of thought, whose subject is thought, okay, and reality at the same time, and say, okay, this is science, you're basically applying the logic of an infinite object to a finite one. It's a little like if capital were actually a circle of reality versus a pseudo circle, which Marx says it is. It's a pseudo syllogism of production, circulation, and distribution, right? And the reason why he points out that it is a pseudo circle is that it is not all of reality fully encompassing. In other words, there was historically a before capitalism and an after. You can't say that about reality. You can't say that about you can't say that about the universe and reality. Reality is going to go on without us. If you said that about capitalism, there'd be no point to being a communist in the first place. This is a point that Harrison actually made to me when I was going through and trying to distinguish what I was looking at. But what we're dealing here with the idea are infinite objects of both thought and being. And the accent has to be equally on thought and being, not. I guess you could say the accent on being is more decisive historically and just generally, right? Because, humans might disappear in the next, million years, let's say. And then the thought sphere that we've built up, I mean, it's going to mean nothing. But being will go on as it is, still structured by dialectical reality and such. Okay, Kyle, read 1634, please. You can read it straight out of the book, but having reached the result.
Yeah, I figured I'd do both. But having reached a result that the idea is the unity of the notion and objectivity is the true, and it must not be regarded merely as a goal to which we have to approximate, but which itself always remains a kind of beyond. On the contrary, we must recognize that everything actual is only insofar as it possesses the idea and expresses it. It is not merely that the object, the objective and subjective world in general, ought to be congruous with the idea, but they are themselves congruence of notion and reality. The reality does not correspond to the notion, its mere appearance, the subjective, contingent, capricious element that is not the truth.
Okay, so here he's breaking out how the idea is both reality and the notion, and this goes back to how being. I guess it goes back to the phenomenology, really, at the very end, where absolute knowledge contains the truth that subject and object, that thought and thinking are in unity as the same thing, right? But also internally differentiated. It's kind of cool the way he sort of breaks this out, I think.
Yeah, it sounded very Platonic to me.
Yeah. And he even
Plato,
says the reality
Plato,
that does not correspond to the notion is mere appearance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's definitely Plato.
I need to read Plato. I haven't read beyond maybe one of the books in full. A hole in my education. Okay, I'm going to read 1635. How far down does this go to life? We could do it. 1635. When it is said that no object is to be found in experience that is perfectly congruous with the idea, one is opposing the idea as a subjective standard to the actual. But what anything actual is supposed in truth to be, if its notion is not in it, and if its objectivity does not correspond in its notion at all, it is impossible to say, for it would be nothing. Right? It is true that the mechanical and chemical object, like the non-spiritual subject and the spirit that is conscious only of the finite, not of its essence, do not, according to their various natures, have their notion existent in them in its own free form. But they can only be true at all insofar as they are the union of their notion and reality, of their soul and their body. Wholes, like the state and the church, cease to exist when the unity of their notion and their reality is dissolved. Man, the living being, is dead when soul and body are parted in him. Dead nature, the mechanical and chemical world, taking, that is, the dead world to mean the inorganic world, otherwise it would have no positive meaning at all. Dead nature, then, if it is separated into its notion and its reality, is nothing but the subjective abstraction of a thought form and a formless matter. So basically, it's all in your head if you think you can separate what are actually in unity in real life, right? That disembodied dead thought form does not exist in real life. And the only way it can is if it has a real life bearer, a Traeger, sort of like the dollar bills in your pocket are bearers of value, right? Spirit that was not idea was not the unity of the notion with its own self, or the notion that did not have the notion itself for its reality would be dead, spiritless spirit, a material object. Okay, so he's breaking out. He's breaking out the idea and the idea of reality that didn't actually have being associated with it. And so really what he's saying is that if in his system the scientific form of the category holds the unity of thought and being, he is showing you how if there's no actual being to the object you're talking about, it's just a mere thought that has no congruence in the real world. And we can do that every day. I can think about winning the lottery and it hasn't happened, right? And that is, a dead spiritless spirit or idea, you know. So that's where he's kind of going with that. Um, Jim, you want to hit 1636?
Almost kind of feels like that. Was trying to think, almost like life itself is. God, I thought about it, like it's like the active move. It's an active movement. In this case, it's a thing that has to be obviously have a reality to it, but also kind of has to be itself a whole thing. Otherwise, it's static and then not really. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you put it that way because if you really think about it, even dead, lifeless thoughts are possessed of the idea. I mean, they are because you created them, they came out of you. It's only the creation of thought is drilling down better, I think, that would lead you to believe that it is a dead idea. Even dead ideas are alive, but you can talk yourself into thinking that you can have the separate thought.
Oh yeah, and the whole thing earlier of the means and end is the only way that that idea stays alive because it has some congruence in the real world, which eventually is the intention of cognition to the absolute idea, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he really breaks it out.
And the idea being the unity of notion and reality, being has attained the significance of truth. Therefore, what now is not is only what is idea. Therefore, what now is only what is idea. Finite things are finite because they do not possess the complete reality of their notion within themselves, but require everything to complete it. Or conversely, because they are presupposed as objects, hence presents the notion as an external determination, the highest to which they attain on the side of this finitude to external purposiveness. That actual things are not congruous with the idea is a side of their finitude and untruth. And in accordance with this side, they are objects, determined in accordance with their various spheres and in the relationships of objectivity, either mechanically, chemically, or by an external end. That the idea has not completely leavened its reality, has imperfectly subdued it to the notion. This is a possibility arising from the fact that the idea itself has a restricted content, that though it is essentially the unity of notion and reality, it is no less essentially their difference, for only the object is their immediate, that is merely implicit unity. But if an object, for example, the state, did not correspond at all to its idea, that is, if in fact it was not the idea of the state at all, if its reality, which is the self-conscious individuals, did not correspond at all to the notion, the soul and its body would have parted. The former would escape into the solitary regions of thought. The latter would have broken up into the single individualities.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, so here in 1636, he's really breaking down what it looks like when in thought and thinking about things, you bisect reality from what you're trying to bring out in thought when you talk about that reality. And So, like I said, when you're dealing practically with everyday objects, our usual mode is finite thinking. It's understanding, and they require other things to complete it for a more comprehensive truth. Some of what he's talking about here can be referenced in the phenomenology, how consciousness deals with its objects. And those objects, like he says here, are determined in accordance with their various spheres and the relationships of objectivity, either mechanically, chemically, or by an external end. So he's talking about things like the hard sciences, right? Mechanically and chemically, and the external end, which is the teleology chapter. You know, if you're wondering what that means, just think about what use an apple has for us. Provides food, sustenance. But when you talk about the apple, you're not actually talking about what it is in it for itself, right? So an external end, like here, the finitude is a purpose for us, or as Hegel likes to say, a purpose for an other, right? So if you find an object in the logic and you find that it is related to its other, then that's basically what it means, is that the object is not actually what it is at the very end of the chapter. It is what it is for another purpose, another, you know, a thing other than itself is what I'm trying to get at. Okay. Blah, blah, blah.
It's
Kyle.
interesting that he uses
Oh,
the
sorry.
state.
Yeah, go ahead. What's
Interesting
that?
that he state as his example, but in Plato, though, he has a whole dialogue devoted to the form of justice. That's the Republic,
Yeah.
and in Platonic philosophy, that's key because because Plato drew an analogy between the structure of the individual self, and the structure of the polis of the city state, especially the ideal city state,
Yeah.
which is what he discusses in the Republic. So he connects the notion of the just state with the notion of the just individual, and they both are ordered in the same way, in a very similar way. The rational part of the soul or self being up top,
Yeah.
and the emotions are below, are under the control of the rational. And he sees in the ideal city, it's the same way. The rational, which would then be the guardians, or the philosopher kings, or whatever you want to call them, they'd be
Yeah.
on top and in control of the state.
It's amazing how in the modern era those ideas and relationships are flatly so flatly interpreted on the empirical side, because he's not just talking about an empirical philosopher king,
Yeah,
because the philosopher king wouldn't be what he was unless he was basically grounded in his actual notion, right? But because metaphysics has been so attacked and destroyed in the academy, when they get out the Plato to teach you, it actually appears like some sort of like weird Neoplatonic, world in the clouds versus what Plato was actually talking about. I, and with that in mind, I love how Hegel actually like recenters it here. I think you're absolutely right. Kyle, short few sentences here, 1637.
But
But because the notion,
yeah, but because the notion of the state so essentially constitutes the nature of these individualities, it is present in them as an urge so powerful that they are impelled to translate it into reality, be it only for in the form of external purposiveness, or to put up with it as it is, or else they must needs perish. The worst state, one which reality least corresponds to the notion, insofar as it still exists, is still idea. The individuals still obey a dominant notion.
Yeah. So here I'm really feeling Marx's commentary on the ruling class and the ruling class ideas. So think of America. America is described as the state of freedom, et cetera, et cetera. There's all these different adjectives that say that America is this, it's just, it's good, it, will do your laundry for you and not complain, right? But the reality is still a reality according to Hegel. It's just that it doesn't conform to its notion, but individuals still obey a dominant notion of the state. The state is still there, right? And I think it's the same thing with art and religion. Christianity can still call itself Christianity, but if it's a Christianity based on authority, what Hegel calls the positive Christianity, as opposed to the one obeying its real notion, then it's not what it's not its appearance. It isn't what it is advertised to be in reality. Woo! Clear as mud. Okay, 1638. However, the idea has not merely the more general meaning of the true being, of the unity of notion and reality, but the more specific one of the unity of subjective notion and objectivity. That is to say, the notion as such is itself already the identity of itself in reality. For the indefinite expression reality means in general nothing else but determinate being, and this the notion possesses in its particularity and individuality. Yeah. Similarly, too, objectivity is the total notion that out of its determinateness has withdrawn into identity with itself. In the former subjectivity, the determinateness or difference of the notion is an illusory being that is immediately sublated and has withdrawn into being for self or negative unity. It is an inhering predicate. But in this objectivity, the determinateness is posited as an immediate totality, as an external whole. Now the idea has shown itself to be the notion, liberated again into its subjectivity, i.e., within us, from the immediacy in which it is submerged in the object. To be the notion that distinguishes itself from its objectivity, which, however, is no less determined by it and possesses its substantiality only in that notion. This identity has therefore rightly been defined as the subject-object, for it is as well the formal or subjective notion as it is the object as such. But this must be understood more precisely. The notion, having truly attained its reality, is this absolute judgment whose subject, as self-related negative unity, distinguishes itself from its objectivity and is the latter's being in self and for self, but essentially relates itself to it through itself. It is therefore its own end and the urge to realize it. But for this very reason, the subject does not possess objectivity in an immediate manner, for if it did, it would be merely the totality of the object as such lost in objectivity. On the contrary, objectivity is the realization of the end, an objectivity posited by the activity of the end, an objectivity which, as positedness, possesses its subsistence and its form only as permeated by its subject. As objectivity, it has in it the moment of the externality of the notion and is therefore, As objectivity, it has in it the moment of the externality of the notion, and is therefore in general the side of finitude, change in appearance, the side, however, which meets with extinction in its retraction into the negative unity of the notion. The negative whereby its indifferent mutual externality exhibits itself as unessential and a positivity is the notion itself. So here he's talking about, here I think he's talking about our firmware, but I'm not entirely sure because the subject object that relates itself to itself is the idea.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just also the whole thing you have to describe it from both the identity of identity and difference to see both sides of this. That kind of still throws me in following.
It's almost like he's coding a lot of it because when he talks about the externality of the notion and
Mhm.
how it's the side of finitude, change in appearance, you know, we subsist in externality as a finite that changes and has appearance. But I'm not sure if he's just talking about the relation of, yeah. I so actually I'm he gives a therefore right after this. So maybe that'll explain it a little. The idea is therefore, in spite of the subjectivity, utterly simple and immaterial. Oh, for the externality exists only as determined by the notion and it as taken up into its negative unity. Insofar as it exists as indifferent externality, it is not merely at the mercy of mechanism in general, but exists only as the transitory and untrue. Interesting. Although, therefore, the idea has its reality in a material externality. Okay, here we go. This is not an abstract being subsisting on its own account over against the notion. On the contrary, it exists only as a becoming through the negativity of indifferent being, as a simple determinateness of the notion.
I actually wrote down as a shorthand. There's idea is determinate being of concept or notion.
Okay.
This is try to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because at this point, the relationship of the unity is subject and object both together, and then subject object as separate, which is also internal and external.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Internal thought and being.
Yes. Okay, let's just keep reading. 1640, Jim.
Okay. This yields the following more precise definitions of the idea. First, it is the simple truth, the identity of the notion and objectivity as a universal in which the opposition and subsistence of the particular is dissolved into its self-identical negativity and is equality with itself. Secondly, it is the relation of the explicit subjectivity of the simple notion and its objectivity, which is distinguished, therefore, from the former. Is former essentially the urge to sublate this separation, and the latter is the indifferent positiveness, the subsistence that is in and for itself null. As this relation, the idea is the process of sundering itself into individuality and its inorganic nature, and again of bringing this inorganic nature under the power of the subject and returning to the first simple universality. The identity of the idea with itself is one with the process, the thought which liberates actuality from the illusory show of purposeless mutability and transfigures it into the idea must not represent this truth of actuality as a dead repose, as a mere picture, lifeless, without impulse or movement, as a genius or a number or an abstract thought, by virtue of the freedom which the notion attains in the idea. The idea possesses within itself also the most stubborn opposition. The repose consists in the security and certainty into which it eternally creates and eternally overcomes that opposition in its meeting with itself.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. And what is Hegel describing here? To me, he's describing what thinking itself is. The idea in its process, combined with its finite subjectivity as, you know, as a real world object, i.e., our brain, I guess you could say, thinking is, I mean, this is what thinking is. It's the identity of the notion and objectivity as a universal, and is the relation of the subjectivity and objectivity. And you notice subjectivity is the urge to sublate, the separation. And the latter is the indifferent positiveness. Okay? So if you think about objective philosophy, you have a set of dead categories. But Hegel says it's not just a set of dead categories, it's what thinking does with them as well. And that's our subjectivity. And so you have this urge, to think, you have this urge to move these objects, right? And notice in the first two books, you get this picture of the objects moving by themselves, but they're not moving by themselves. Thinking is moving them, and thinking is the weird third person activity that he narrates, and he's narrating it because this is thinking as a universal. It's not like an individual philosopher or even a particular philosophical school. This is thinking as a process, as a universal, everybody does it kind of process. And that's why he wrote it this way. I have no idea why he wrote it this way from that universal thinking perspective, but I would imagine it did wonders for covering over a lot of what he was doing from the censors. Because, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but the first time I read this, a lot of it is just impenetrable. Once you realize what he's doing, it's like, oh, okay, all right. So this is thinking about this object. And to our understanding of it, we pick it apart. And all the parts are dead parts, just as much as if you read an anatomy textbook. It's a dead heart, dead lungs, dead liver. As a whole system, it's a living system. With Hegel's system, it's a living system only when it is subject to the subject, which thinks. Make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, I think I understand this chapter a lot more than I did the first time, and now I'm like, okay, I have an even better like notion. Because I keep wanting to think of an empirical man who is making this happen, and it's more universal than that. It's the process of thinking itself. It's not just a man thinking. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
As I say, I thought it was interesting kind of seeing especially even with Spinoza, the whole kind of thinking versus physicality. Like there's the thinking substance and the physical substance, and here it sort of like falls out in a much more, real way, and how they're interrelated, interdependent on each other.
I think Spinoza says the same thing, but in different
Yeah.
language, and
Yeah.
I couldn't speak to it yet until I read it.
Same. I'm just like the generic. I'm not just Spinoza, but that kind of era of thinking period of time where thinking was thought to be a separate substance
Ah,
in that period.
Spinoza, um, that's a good subject. Descartes
Yeah.
portrayed them as separate things. Spinoza said, no, they're the same thing. The order of things is the same as the order of thought. So he expressed that in one place or another. I don't think that's actually his quote, but it's like a paraphrase from somewhere I
Right.
forget.
I just remember Spinoza was reacting to it. I couldn't remember who said it, but yeah, Descartes, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I can't remember if it was Descartes or if it was Hobbes that he that that he saw on the street. I can't remember which one was a contemporary.
The Descartes definitely who I was trying to recall.
Hobbes is a contemporary.
Hobbes was a contemporary. Well, then he definitely met Hobbes in real life, or at least saw him walking on the street. um, Somewhere around
He
the
met
Hague.
Leibniz. We know that.
The,
That's something we know about.
well, I know when he lived at the Hague, and I think he lived at the Hague at one point or another. He definitely encountered one of those guys who was his contemporary. Um, um, can you imagine that? You know, Hobbes just walking down the street, and you're like, "Hey, buddy, what's going on?" That's that's nuts. Who read last?
You?
Was that me?
Yep.
Okay. Kyle. So 1641 in the first instance.
Yeah, I've been slowly deciding I'm going to start writing these paragraphs in my copy just to
Yeah.
look them up. In the first instance, however, the idea is once again only immediate or only in its notion. Objective reality is, it is true, conformable to the notion, but it is not yet liberated into the notion, and the latter does not exist explicitly for itself as notion.
Yeah.
Thus, the notion is soul. Thus, though the notion is soul, the soul is in the guise of an immediate. That is, its determinateness does not appear as soul itself. It does not grasp itself as soul. It does not possess its objective reality within itself. The notion is as a soul that is not yet fully a soul.
Yep. So basically a complete objectivity, but it is not yet a full subjectivity in the immediate. So that's pretty cut and dried. 1642, Jim?
At this first stage, the idea is life, the notion that, distinguished from its objectivity, simple within itself, pervades its objectivity, and as its own end, possesses the means in the objectivity and posits the latter as its means, yet is immanent in this means, and is therein the realized end that is identical with itself. The idea, on account of its immediacy, has individuality for the form of its existence. But the reflection into self of its absolute process is a sublating of this immediate individuality, thereby the notion which, as universality in this individuality, is the inwardness of the latter, converts the externality into universality, or posits its objectivity as being the same as itself.
Thanks, Jim. And here he's starting to describe things which conform, and he's later going to say conform to what nature is. Nature is permeated with life, and when you're looking at this, being, right? It is in itself, but is not for itself in terms of thinking in itself, I guess you could say. Um, converts the externality into universality. Yeah. So when you're thinking thoughts about life, you know, this last part, converting the externality of reality into a universality that's separate from subjectivity, thinking that thinks, right? This is sort of the immediate version of the idea. Kyle, 1643.
In the second stage, the idea is the idea of the true and the good as cognition and volition. In the first instance, it is finite cognition and finite volition, in which the true and the good are still distinguished, and each appears as yet only as a goal. The notion has, in the first instance, liberated itself into itself, and as yet given itself only as abstract objectivity for its reality. But the process of this finite cognition and action converts the initially abstract universality into a totality, whereby it becomes a complete objectivity. Or, to consider it from the other side, finite, that is, subjective spirit, makes for itself the presupposition of an objective world, just as life has such a presupposition, but its activity consists in sublating this presupposition and converting it into a positiveness. In this way, its reality is for it the objective world, or conversely, the objective world is the ideality in which it cognizes itself.
So, thank you, Kyle. What is he talking about here? He is talking about this.
Yeah.
The contents of the philosophy of spirit is exactly what he's talking about in 1643. 1642, he's talking about the philosophy of nature and how one can cognize what nature is as the idea in its immediacy or the externality of the absolute idea. It's one of those funny things. If I were the translator of the logic, if I were to retranslate the logic, I would take these two specific paragraphs and put a heading over it, calling it nature and calling it spirit. First stage of the idea is life, nature. The second stage is spirit, the idea of the true and the good as cognition and volition. So thinking and will. What else does spirit do, especially in its subjectivity? Psychology, phenomenology, those are right under this heading. And I'm just going to cap off this reading by saying, thirdly, and this is the, yeah, remember it always comes in threes. Thirdly, spirit cognizes the idea as its absolute truth, as the truth that is in and for itself. The infinite idea in which cognition and action are equalized, and which is the absolute knowledge of itself. So I wouldn't call this a synthesis so much as the final syllogism of well, I wouldn't say it's the final. Maybe it is the final. I don't know. Is it the final countdown? I don't know. I'm trying to think how congruently we can look at these three paragraphs, 42, 43, and 44, and the end of philosophy of spirit, because the end of philosophy of spirit has the final syllogism, which contains notion, nature, and spirit, right? So I'm thinking that this is just sort of describing. What am I thinking? Could 44 just be logic? Third, spirit, cognizes the idea as its absolute truth,
So
as the
it
truth
goes
in it for itself, the infinite idea in which cognition and action are equalized, and which is the absolute knowledge of itself. So
it's at
really,
the end of mind that comes back to logic.
well, what this looks like to me is that logic, thirdly, is recognized itself in both nature and spirit.
Right.
It's the combining force.
It's
I get which it is. It
the
is
absolute
absolutely.
the absolute syllogism at the end, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. See, I wish there was more commentary here saying maybe something along the lines of logic is here the middle term. But see, he doesn't present these last three or four paragraphs talking about the syllogism at all. He's just talking about the elements of the later syllogism. You know what I mean? And so it makes me think that this is probably not like the full syllogization. It's just what each element does in and for itself. Does that make sense? Like we haven't gotten there yet, where nature relates to spirit, relates to logic, logic relates to nature, you know, all of those things, because that's the syllogism. He's not positing any relation between these three paragraphs here. He's just defining them.
I think you have to go through the chapters like in life and cognition and so forth
Yeah.
before you can do that.
Yeah. And even when you do that, he's really only defining them according to the logic, according to the absolute idea. Idea. So thinking is thinking thought itself, and organizing how we're supposed to think about life and think about uh wherever we're going. Shit. The idea of the good. And then absolute idea is the final piece. Awesome. Well, it's 9:07 and I want to hand out the next assignment. I actually think going through this part slowly is really going to help us later when we get into nature. Because rather than taking the immediacy of the idea, which nature is, for a spiritual object, which it is not, you know, we're going to be able to speak intelligently about uh, what's there. So, um, why don't we um, read Life, chapter 1, from page 761 to 774. It's a few pages long, but honestly, if you read it off of this, you know, several entries a day, it goes pretty quick. Actually. Yeah. Life, cognition, absolute idea. Yeah. Shit. That's awesome. Um, I'm really interested to read the life section and then start reading nature because I want to see. I'm sure they're pretty parallel in a lot of ways, but the externalized idea as nature, separately from how we cognize life, is probably I don't want to say a different object. It's the same object, but right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's done this, but if nobody's done it, somebody should put together like a online version of the logic with hyperlinks to the corresponding sections in like the philosophy of nature or philosophy of mind or the
Or the
phenomenology.
phenomenology, yeah, because an awful lot of the second book on essence, a lot of the categories and the way that they're handled line right up with the phenomenology of spirit.
I was
Uh,
also thinking, even as a starting point, as a relationship, but even connecting the two logics together on top of that.
yeah, M- my well, I mean, I'm not an expert, but my current thought, because I've been talking to Harrison so long about this, is that the order of the categories and their basic import you should get from the encyclopedia. You want to get the transitions, you read Science of Logic. But the Science of Logic is reading it, unfortunately, is a little like reading the book that came out on philosophy of right, which is that it was written for the censors and for the religious authorities that were sort of looking over Hegel's shoulder. But his students in his class knew knew what was written for the censors and what was written for posterity, basically. And the closest you can get to posterity is the encyclopedia, I think, with the details fully mapped out, along with the commentary for the censors. I follow Harrison in that regard until I decide that it's otherwise. But so far, I haven't found any reason not to think that way. I'm just glad enough of it survived that you can tell the difference between the two still. You know what I mean? Because an awful lot of Hegel's work was actually lost. Anyway, comrades, I'm pretty sure I'm good to go for next Monday on the 2nd. I don't see any reason not to be. But if you guys want to skip the 2nd because it's Thanksgiving weekend, we could do that.
I'm happy back at work anyways, so I'm fine.
Jim, are you
Yeah.
good?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then let's plan to meet back here next Monday at 8. Kyle, just to remind you, this Saturday, Alex is not having, well, Alex and I are not having the class, so we'll be taking the week off.
I saw that and that works for me since I probably won't even be in, I'm not sure if I'll be in a good place anyway, so just for internet.
Yeah, totally. All right, comrades, have a wonderful night. We'll see you soon.
See ya.